In the small American town of Greenfield, Peter and Lucy's home sat on a quiet street lined with blooming roses. They appeared to live an enviable life. Peter, not yet old but with a calm, composed demeanor, had a sturdy build and an intense look in his eyes, a remnant of his years in the military. After leaving the service, he had secured a position as a security consultant, and with his extensive field experience, he quickly became indispensable to the company, providing stable financial support for his family. Because of the demands of his job, Peter often traveled, always on the move. Each time he set off, he would stand at the door and embrace Lucy tightly, promising he'd be back soon. At first, these farewells were palled with reluctance, but over time, Lucy grew used to them. She would smile and wave goodbye, watching as Peter's car turned the corner and disappeared from view. Lucy, Peter's wife, was a gentle and caring woman. Slender and graceful, she was seen by neighbors as a hard-working and kind mother. Every morning, Lucy tended to the garden, took the kids to school, and then went to the Pollet to pick up fresh ingredients for dinner. Though the days were simple, she poured boundless care into her home. Neighbors often repalled on her warmth and kindness. She was always willing to listen to others' small troubles, becoming a beloved figure in town. Yet, deep down, Lucy began to feel an unspoken loneliness. Peter was frequently away for work, leaving her to manage the household on her own, already accustomed to the silence that followed the children's chatter. Gradually, she found herself bottling up these feelings, knowing that Peter needed her support, and that she couldn't add to his burdens. Instead, Lucy dedicated most of her time to community activities, volunteering at the church to help those in need, and finding some solace for herself. When involved in church activities, she often forgot her own isolation and felt she was still needed, which brought her moments of inner peace. This routine continued. Peter remained busy on the road, while Lucy led a seemingly calm life in town. Whenever Peter was away, he would send postcards or occasionally make a call, telling Lucy he missed home. But even these small gestures only provided fleeting comfort, unable to truly fill the growing loneliness in Lucy's heart. The nights in Greenfield were always quiet, and Lucy would stand by the window, gazing at the dark street as if Peter were just there, walking towards her. But in reality, the room was empty, and she was left alone, waiting for news of Peter's next return home. A few months ago, Greentown welcomed a new priest to its church, Father Paul. He was tall and lean, with a warm look in his eyes. His voice was deep and powerful as he spoke, and his words were compelling, as if each sentence could reach into a person's soul. His sermons often touched on the struggles of daily life and finding inner peace, and his presence left a lasting impression on the townsfolk who came to listen. Gradually, Father Paul became a trusted spiritual anchor for nearly everyone in town, earning widespread admiration for his charm and sincerity. The first time Lucy heard Father Paul's sermon, she was deeply captivated. His unique voice and comforting words seemed to touch the most vulnerable parts of her heart, offering her a glimpse of solace in her otherwise lonely life. She began to attend church activities more frequently, always sitting in the front row, hanging onto every word Paul said. After the sermons, Lucy would often linger to chat briefly with him, their topics ranging from faith and family to small details of daily life. Paul would listen patiently, nodding occasionally with a gentle smile, his eyes filled with understanding and warmth. As time passed, Paul's unique care for the congregation became more apparent. He would kindly ask each person about their recent experiences, listen to their troubles, and even make personal visits to bring them a special kind of comfort. Toward Lucy, Paul showed a particularly deep concern. He could always sense her mood, gently guiding her through her thoughts, as if he knew of her unspoken loneliness and inner struggles. Each time they talked, Lucy felt a new strength building within her, increasingly relying on these conversations, eagerly anticipating her next meeting with Paul. In the church, each time their eyes met, Lucy felt a powerful yet indescribable sense of closeness. Their relationship began to transcend ordinary spiritual support, transforming into a deeper, warmer connection. For Lucy, Paul had become a unique confidant, the one person who brought comfort and meaning to her solitary life. With Peter's work becoming increasingly demanding, his frequent business trips left silence as a constant presence at home, and Lucy's encounters with Paul became ever more frequent. Their conversations, initially mere exchanges of inner thoughts, gradually grew warmer. Lucy confided in Paul about the details of her daily life, and Paul, in his own unique way, provided comfort, helping her through her solitary moments. With each meeting, Lucy found that Paul was not only someone she could talk to, but the one person who seemed to truly understand her. As they spent more time together, their secret meetings in the church became more frequent. Every time they sat together in that hidden corner, Lucy felt her concealed emotions becoming harder to suppress. Their reliance on one another grew stronger, and their words carried a subtle tenderness. Paul's gaze held warmth and understanding, and whenever he spoke softly to her, Lucy felt her heart race, a feeling she had long forgotten. One day, Paul gently held Lucy's hand in the church, a warm and firm touch that seemed to shatter the last barrier between them. In that moment, the quiet of the church felt almost breathless, everything around them blurred, as if only their presence was real. They shared a knowing look, and from then on, their connection was no longer a simple emotional dependency, but had evolved into a deep attachment. After that, Lucy and Paul began to have more secret moments in that secluded corner of the church. They spoke in hushed voices, sometimes shared gentle embraces, and could even feel each other's heartbeat. In this hidden space, their relationship took shape, filling the loneliness and suppression Lucy had felt with Paul's caring presence. For Paul, too, Lucy's attachment offered a solace and a sense of fulfillment he hadn't found elsewhere. Thus, a hidden romance blossomed between Lucy and Paul in the quiet of the church. Each time they exchanged a glance, Lucy felt an indescribable warmth, as if her lonely, monotonous life had finally been illuminated by a gentle light. The townspeople had sharp eyes, and the subtle changes in Lucy's relationship with Paul didn't escape their attention. At first, the residents only muttered privately, thinking Lucy was just overly enthusiastic about the new priest. But as the two were seen frequently in secluded corners of the church, some couldn't help but begin to gossip. Lucy would always stay late at the church, often later than everyone else, and Paul seemed to show her particular care. These details piqued everyone's curiosity and suspicion. Despite the growing rumors, Lucy and Paul did not stop their secret meetings. Whenever someone mentioned the gossip about her and Paul, Lucy would brush it off with a calm smile, as if the talk didn't affect her at all. Yet, deep down, she felt a slight unease, as if the emotions she had tried to keep hidden were gradually being revealed. Still, her attachment to Paul had grown too strong to resist, and each encounter with him made her feel as if life had regained its light. Meanwhile, Peter, though often away for work, keenly noticed the changes in Lucy. Each time he returned home, Lucy's attitude was no longer as warm and attentive as before. Her gaze seemed distant, and her expression had an air of detachment. Lucy began to go out frequently, no longer preparing dinner for his return, sometimes staying at the church late into the evening. This coldness left Peter confused and stung by a vague sense of neglect. Peter began to pay closer attention to Lucy's movements, trying to uncover the reason for her change in mood. Whenever he tried asking her casually about church activities, her answers were always brief and dismissive. Suspicion gradually filled Peter's heart as he struggled to suppress his uneasiness, only to find it growing deeper with each passing day. On a gloomy, rainy day, Peter's suspicions had reached a boiling point, and he decided to investigate Lucy's secrets himself. He threw on his raincoat and silently followed her steps. When he saw her heading straight to the church, the sharp sting of confirmation made him hold his breath. Concealing himself in a shadowy corner of the church, he kept his gaze locked on Lucy. Raindrops trickled down from the eaves, and the dim, weak light in the church cast their figures clearly before Peter's eyes. Through the small window, he could see Lucy and Paul talking softly, their eyes filled with a tenderness and attachment he had never seen on her face before. After a moment, Paul gently took Lucy's hand, and instead of pulling away, She responded to his touch. Peter felt as though something had struck him in the chest, and in an instant, anger erupted within him. Overcome with rage, Peter pushed open the church doors with a thundering crash that shattered the silence. Lucy and Paul turned around in shock, confronted by Peter's furious gaze. Lucy's face instantly turned pale as she gasped his name. Peter could hardly believe what he was seeing, but his anger drove him forward as he demanded an explanation from both Lucy and Paul. Lucy was visibly panicked, stammering as she tried to explain, but Peter wasn't listening at all. He turned to Paul, demanding to know why he would want to destroy his family with Lucy. Paul, though clearly shaken, tried to maintain his composure and, with a steady tone, said to Peter, "There's nothing between Lucy and me beyond the usual church interactions, Peter. You've misunderstood." He desperately tried to defuse Peter's anger, even attempting to use his role as a priest to encourage Peter to calm down. But the flames of anger within Peter were beyond containment, and he retorted with a scornful laugh, "Just ordinary interactions? Are you saying you have no intentions toward my wife?" Faced with Peter's accusations, Paul was at a loss for words, resorting to speaking softly to urge Peter to calm down. However, Peter's emotions were already in complete turmoil. As he looked at Lucy's pale, nervous face, the pain in his heart turned into a burning fury. Peter's accusations struck a nerve in Paul, leaving him feeling cornered, with fear slowly overtaken by a rising anger. Seeing Peter's relentless questioning, each word piercing like a blade, Paul's expression darkened. He knew that if Peter exposed everything, his position and the trust of the parishioners would be shattered, and Lucy would suffer irreparable damage. With Peter closing in, Paul instinctively clenched his fists, a glint of desperation flashing in his eyes. Suddenly he lunged forward, forcefully shoving Peter, hoping to make him back off. Peter stumbled, but quickly regained his balance, staring at Paul with fierce anger, then lunged forward, throwing a punch. Paul, however, managed to dodge Peter's blow, his gaze darting around as he desperately searched for a means of defense. In a dim corner of the church, Paul caught sight of a heavy candlestick standing by the altar. An idea sparked, and he quickly rushed over, seizing the iron candlestick, and, in one swift motion, swung it down hard towards Peter. Peter tried to dodge, but moved a fraction too slowly, the candlestick landing heavily on his shoulder, sending him reeling back in pain. But Paul didn't pause. He raised the candlestick again and struck, this time hitting Peter's head. The heavy impact echoed through the church as Peter staggered, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief. Moments later, his body slumped to the ground, blood slowly trickling from his head, staining the cold floor beneath. Seeing Peter lying motionless, Lucy clapped a hand over her mouth, retreating a few steps in horror, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. She had never imagined things would escalate into such a tragedy. Paul himself stood frozen, staring at Peter's motionless form, the candlestick in his trembling hand, as if only now realizing the enormity of what he had done. After a brief, heavy silence, Paul steadied his breath, his gaze turning cold and resolute. He approached Lucy, whispering, "We have to cover this up. No one can know about this." Lucy's face turned pale as she struggled internally, but under Paul's steely gaze, she finally gave a slight, fearful nod. Terror and helplessness clouded her mind, leaving her no choice but to follow his instructions. Paul then began to devise a plan for handling Peter's body. Together, he and Lucy cautiously dragged Peter's body to the back storeroom of the church, erasing any traces of blood and removing his personal belongings to cover any evidence left behind. Peter's sudden disappearance caused quite a stir in the small town, with neighbors speculating about his whereabouts. Facing the questions, Paul remained calm and composed, continuing to fulfill his duties as a priest. He would even mention Peter during his sermons, praising his dedication to family and work and explaining that Peter had left for such reasons. Paul publicly prayed for Peter's safety, further reassuring the townspeople. This calm facade eased some of their doubts, but Lucy couldn't shake her own fear and unease. Whenever she recalled the events of that fateful night, she felt as if a chill gripped her heart, weighed down by guilt and dread. Yet, under Paul's gentle reassurances, she forced herself to accept everything. But fate soon dealt them another blow. One early morning, a longtime churchgoer named Danny happened to enter the church's storage room. In the dimly lit corner, he seemed to notice something suspicious. Although he didn't immediately share his discovery, he hinted privately to Paul that he knew more than he let on. Danny's veiled threat sent Paul into a panic. He understood that if anyone uncovered the truth, his carefully constructed facade would collapse, and Peter's disappearance would become the town's central focus. A few days later, Paul discreetly lured Danny to a quiet road near the church, inviting him under the pretense of having a talk to offer support and care. As night fell and the surroundings grew still, Paul seized a moment when Danny was off guard and, in an act of desperation, ended the man's life. He hid Danny's body in the church's basement, concealing yet another dark secret. Danny's disappearance created new ripples in the community, but Paul maintained his calm disguise as if nothing had ever happened. In the small town, the disappearance of Peter and Danny increasingly caught the attention and concern of the townspeople. The local police finally began investigating, and although Paul initially managed to dispel some suspicions with his usual calm demeanor and disguise, as time went on, the police gradually noticed Paul's behavior becoming more unusual. Rumors began to spread around town, and some started to suspect whether the church's priest was somehow involved in the disappearances, especially as his behavior grew more mysterious and difficult to understand. As the investigation progressed, the police found some clues that made them realize there might be darker secrets hidden behind Paul. They decided to search the church. They finally discovered Danny's body in a secluded corner of the church. His remains were hidden in a dark basement, meticulously disguised and concealed. The police were shocked by the discovery and immediately reported it to their superiors. This revelation exploded through the small town like a bomb. The residents were horrified to learn about Danny's cause of death and the possible connection to Paul. Panic quickly spread. People began recalling Paul's previous kindness and realized there might have been an unimaginable evil hidden behind his gentle face. As the investigation continued, Paul's true nature slowly came to light, and the townsfolk who had once trusted him began to feel deeply betrayed. The atmosphere in the town grew increasingly tense as everyone thought back to Peter's disappearance, seeming to connect everything back to the same person, Paul. Panic and unease continued to spread throughout the town. Many people started to reevaluate their own relationship with Paul, worried that they, too, might have been unknowingly drawn into this terrifying conspiracy. When Paul realized that the police investigation was uncovering his secrets, he knew he could no longer hide his past crimes. A wave of fear and regret surged within him, trapping him in a snare he couldn't escape. With no hesitation, Paul chose to flee. He understood he could no longer stay in town, so he decided to escape through the nearby forest, hoping to leave behind the place that once gave him refuge. On a dark night, Paul quietly packed his belongings, carrying only a small amount of food and water, and slipped away from the church he had once taken such pride in. He crossed the streets and entered the dense forest, his steps heavy and hurried, a tense atmosphere filling the air. Each step felt like saying goodbye to his past, while guilt and despair churned within him. He once thought he was in control, but now he realized every step was leading him toward ruin. In the forest, Paul didn't dare to rest. With each step forward, his fear intensified. Occasionally, the snap of a twig in the distance would make him halt and look around warily. He remembered his former care for the townspeople and the comfort he had provided them, scenes that now felt like a haunting nightmare, coming back to him with full force. His previous faith and sense of authority collapsed in that moment, replaced by unending remorse. Meanwhile, the police had not relented in their pursuit. A seasoned detective named Allison was assigned to lead the chase. With keen insight and a calm, decisive manner, Allison had a knack for finding breakthroughs from the smallest clues. After thoroughly analyzing Paul's escape route, she gradually pieced together his trail. Relying on her sharp instincts and years of experience, she led a large-scale search operation into the forest's edge. The tension in the chase mounted. Allison stayed focused on every clue along the way, guiding her team quickly through the forest's perimeter, steadily closing in on Paul's path. Every piece of disturbed undergrowth and every footprint they tracked strengthened her resolve. She knew Paul would not be easy to capture, but she also knew his escape route would inevitably grow narrower. As time passed, Allison drew ever closer to Paul. The intense pursuit was on the verge of reaching its final climax. Paul's desperate escape through the forest had finally come to an end. As the police encircled him, the path closed off, leaving him nowhere to run. Exhausted both in body and spirit, Paul stumbled in a dense thicket, his legs giving out after hours of fleeing. Before him lay only endless darkness, his ears filled with his own labored breathing and the sound of officers closing in on him. With no strength left to struggle, his heart overflowed with regret and fear. Paul knew that his crimes could no longer be concealed, and his escape had only delayed the inevitable. As a few officers approached, he was swiftly subdued, handcuffed, and led away without resistance. All of his former confidence and strength seemed to vanish in that moment, leaving only a hollow shell of the man he once was. Back in the town, Paul was charged with multiple crimes, including murder and abuse of power, and the legal proceedings began. During the trial, his crimes were exposed one by one. The townsfolk, hearing of his deeds, were filled with shock and fury. The kindly priest who had once commanded such trust and respect now stood revealed as a sinister figure. The trial lasted several weeks, with mounting evidence building a damning case against him. In the end, Paul was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. The once confident priest who had held a place of high regard in the town now faced his punishment with helplessness and despair. After the story came to an end, the small town slowly returned to its usual tranquility. The streets were still peaceful, children played in the sunlight, and bright signs hung in front of the shops, as if everything had gone back to normal. However, the townspeople could never forget Paul's betrayal. Those who had once trusted him, relied on him, now felt a heavy burden whenever they passed by the church. The church was no longer the sanctuary that once comforted their souls. Instead, it had become a place permanently palled by painful memories. Every time the townspeople walked into the old building, they couldn't help but recall the tragedies and hidden secrets that had taken place. The church's bells no longer sounded as sweetly. With every chime, they seemed to remind everyone of the disaster and pain the town had experienced. The residents of the town began to re-examine faith, trust, and the complexity of human nature. They had once believed that priests embodied the highest moral standards, but Paul's betrayal made them realize that trust was not something to be taken for granted, and that darkness could lie hidden even in the most seemingly virtuous individuals. People began to approach the people around them with more caution, no longer placing all their trust in others so easily, and learned to reflect more deeply and stay alert. Paul's story became an eternal scar in the town. Though the residents gradually moved past their sorrow, the emptiness and rift in their hearts could never be repaired.